Do you think every family has a villain, or is it more complicated?
At the table that everyone treats like a stage even when they pretend it is just dinner, my mother cleared her throat, tapped her spoon for attention she had already assumed, and said that my brother deserved the house because he was settling down and building something real while I had always been the independent one who would be fine on my own, and I let the room lean toward him the way it always does. Then I took a slow sip, set my glass down with the kind of calm you only earn after running out of tears, and said that was interesting because I bought it out from under you months ago, and the sound that followed was not anger or applause. It was the kind of silence that tells you nobody ever believed you were capable of playing their game better than they did. And if you want to know how I got to that sentence without shaking, you have to start way before the turkey and the speeches and the fake smiles. I grew up on a running commentary about how boys need stability and girls need grit, how my brother Ryan was a project the family had to fund while I was a project I was supposed to fund myself. And every milestone became a case study that proved their point, because when he stumbled the call went out for everyone to pitch in, while when I stumbled I was told it builds character, and when he wanted a car it appeared like a magic trick that pulled cash out of nowhere, while when I needed help with a deposit I was told that learning to stand on my own 2 feet would make me proud later, and I did stand, and I did build, and I did it without a parade, which they then used as evidence that I did not need one. You know, the type of conversation that pretends to be loving until you listen closely and realize it is a plan being executed without you. The kind where your mother uses words like deserves and legacy and our family name while your father nods like a judge who already read the verdict. And the whole time your brother is smiling into his plate because he has learned that keeping quiet is the easiest way to win, and I wish I could say I was shocked when I realized the house was next, but if you have been the designated self-sufficient child for long enough, then you can see the shape of the next exclusion before it even casts its shadow on the floor. I did not overhear it by accident. I noticed it because the signs were everywhere if you knew where to look. The new insurance file sitting on the desk, the way my mother kept using the word transfer instead of sell, and the tightened tone when property taxes came up as if there were more behind it than a seasonal bill, and when I asked directly whether there was anything I should know, she gave me that sweet, cool voice that says trust me while meaning stay out of it. And then she added that line she loves about me being so capable, which in this house has always translated to we will lean on you emotionally, but not financially, while giving the opposite to Ryan. What changed was not the favoritism, because that stayed steady like a radio you cannot turn off. What changed was me deciding that I was done asking for fairness from people who benefit from the imbalance, and instead of arguing I started taking notes. Because nothing makes a person who manipulates narratives more uncomfortable than facts, and I pulled county notices that anyone could pull if they knew how, and I learned that the taxes had not been paid on schedule, and I learned that the lender had adjusted the escrow in a way that hinted at pressure, and I learned that the house my parents kept calling an heirloom was moving closer to a problem they were hoping to hide until Ryan could be safely parked in the deed. I am not a saint, and I am not a villain. I am the daughter who paid her own way, and then got told that proof of independence was proof of disqualification, and once you accept that the rules are written to keep you in your place, you stop arguing about the rules and you start learning the playbook. So I called a friend who works in real estate, not a shark, just someone who knows the system without romanticizing it, and I asked the question that changed the tone of my voice from wounded to focused, which was how does a person quietly secure a position that matters without announcing herself? And she took a breath that told me she had been waiting for me to ask for years. Then walked me through options that were both perfectly legal and perfectly inconvenient for people who assume their intentions are more important than paperwork. We went over trusts and limited liability structures, and the charming reality that property loyalty means nothing to a bank that needs payments on time, and then we talked about tax liens in simple terms. Not as a scheme, but as a mechanism that exists whether you like it or not, and I learned that if a lien is issued and someone purchases it, the owner has a set period to make it right, and if they do not, the person who holds that paper can move toward a deed. And I sat with that knowledge in my living room on a Tuesday night with the television on mute and thought about every time I had been told to be the bigger person. And I realized that sometimes being the bigger person means using the tools everyone else pretends are dirty even though they are printed on official letterhead. I did not run to do anything reckless. I ran numbers and I checked my savings and I looked at what tightening would mean for me. Fewer dinners out, fewer trips, more hours, more hustle. And I looked at the cost against the price of swallowing another holiday toast about how I was so strong and so independent while a house that holds every birthday photo got funneled to a man who never once stood alone on a bill. And when I weighed it honestly, the numbers might as well have been written in neon. Because the decision was not about walls and a roof, it was about finally refusing to certify their story about me with my silence. So I hired the lawyer my friend recommended, not the one who smiles for holiday cards, the one who reads fine print for sport, and we set up a structure with a name that meant nothing to my family. And I filed for notifications on every change related to that parcel, and I watched the calendar the way I used to watch report cards, and when the lien posted I did not hesitate. I bought it the first morning it was available. Then I went to work like it was any other day, because revenge that works does not arrive with fireworks, it arrives with receipts and deadlines and a clock that belongs to you now. By the end of that week I had a folder that nobody at the table knew existed and a plan that did not require their permission, and when my mother called to say she had something sweet to announce at Thanksgiving and that she hoped I would be gracious, I said of course and meant it, because grace is a lot easier when you already changed the ending, and as I hung up I printed one more document and slipped it into the folder with the kind of steady hands I have never had at that house. Then I poured myself a drink I could finally enjoy and sent a quiet request to the county for certified copies of everything tied to my lien, which was not the last step and not the flashiest, but it was the first real taste of justice I had had in years. And it was enough to make me smile when Ryan texted a picture of a paint color he was considering for a bedroom that did not belong to him. The week after I secured the lien felt bizarre in the way only a calm before a storm can feel when you know you are the one quietly steering the weather front. Because while my parents rehearsed a speech about legacy and my brother wandered around with phone photos of paint swatches like a kid planning a treehouse, I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad, a new P.O. box, and a lawyer who loved paper more than people. And we diagrammed a path that did not require permission, theatrics, or approval, only patience and precision. What I had never understood until that month was how many decisions are made by envelopes and stamps rather than sermons and guilt trips. Because if you file notices in the right places and ask for the right copies and follow the right timelines, the world will move for you even if your family never would. So I filed an affidavit of interest that any clerk would recognize. I registered for duplicate tax notifications so that nothing related to that parcel could be tucked away in a kitchen drawer and forgotten, and I placed the kind of paper marker that does not shout but cannot be ignored by anyone who understands how these systems breathe. When I visited my parents that weekend under the friendly excuse of dropping off a pie, I recognized the dance that used to make me feel small and obedient, the way my mother brought up home insurance in a tone that said this is all so complicated and adult. The way my father shifted the conversation to legacy as if long words could hide shortfalls, and the way Ryan leaned against the counter and made a joke about my city apartment like he was practicing ownership of the house by practicing ownership of conversation, and I smiled in a way that gave nothing away, told my mother the pie would travel well in the freezer, and let the silence after that hang long enough to make her wonder if I knew anything new. I did not argue about fairness because there is nothing to win in that courtroom, only a life sentence of explanations, and I did not ask for honesty because people who are about to take something think they are being honest when they call it deserved. So instead I asked small questions that were really measurements, like whether they had decided which roofer to use in spring because I had heard prices were going wild, or whether their lender had offered a refi because rates were twitching. Again, and when my father said they were waiting on paperwork, I took a sip of lukewarm coffee and pictured the underwriting team seeing my recorded interest and flagging the file with the kind of silent red marker that kills a deal without ever calling you a liar. There is a specific kind of smug that comes from being handed things, and I watched Ryan swim in it like a fish in familiar water, tossing off a comment about how he would finally have a place for a home gym and maybe a nursery someday, followed by a sideways look that said I should be happy for him because women should be nurturing when men achieve, and I let him run his mouth because every sentence was a future embarrassment he was writing for himself. Then I excused myself to take a call. from my attorney even though the phone had not rung, and in my car I reviewed the checklists again and again until the hum in my chest settled into a tempo that felt like control. If you have never placed a boundary on paper, you might not know the feeling of strength that comes from sending a certified letter you do not have to explain to anyone. A simple document that says any alteration or encumbrance affecting this parcel requires notice to the interested party, which is not a threat or a boast or a tantrum, just a line in the sand that a title company will treat like a wall. And when the green receipt came back signed with my mother's careful letters, I sat in my kitchen and let the reality wash over me that I had finally entered a conversation they could not shut down by raising their voices or rolling their eyes. The call started a few days later in that polite, chilly tone people use when they think they are above you but need something from you. My mother asking if I had by any chance been poking around county records because something strange had popped up on an account and the loan officer had requested clarification. And I said I was surprised to hear that because county records are public and accurate, and that if there was confusion we should all sit down and look at the paperwork together, which she declined with a rush of words about being busy this week and next week too, and then she shifted into that weary disappointment she loves, saying she wished I did not make everything adversarial, while I said I was only making things legible. My father tried next, going straight to the language of family honor and asking whether I could remove whatever flag I had raised, because it was complicating something that should be simple. And I told him that if by simple he meant opaque and if by family he meant one child only, then we were finally speaking the same language, and that I would not be removing anything because I had an interest I had paid for with money they never offered me. And he went quiet long enough that I knew he had reached the boundary line and found it firm. The small revenge, if you can call it that without dressing it up, arrived in the form of a calendar alert forwarded by my realtor friend who knew a contractor who knew another contractor. A harmless chain of gossip that started when Ryan tried to book a walkthrough for some fast pre-move cosmetic changes and was told that schedules were tight and costs had just gone up because projects with recorded interests and tax issues tend to eat margin. And while none of this was my doing beyond placing factual paperwork where it belonged, I will not lie and say it did not feel like justice to hear that the man who had never carried the cost of anything was getting his first taste of a market that does not care about his mother's plans. I could have gloated, I could have sent a screenshot, I could have needled him with a joke about how adult life comes with paperwork that smells nothing like fresh paint. But I held my tongue because discipline is the difference between a satisfying story and a chaotic one, and instead I took another step, a quiet one that carried the weight of a shout, by instructing my lawyer to send a straightforward notice to their lender and the title office that any refinance or transfer would require my written acknowledgement, which transformed my presence from rumor to protocol and left them staring at a process they could no longer bully or charm. When my mother finally texted to say that Thanksgiving would be special and that there would be an announcement I should receive with grace because it had been a hard year and Ryan needed stability and family unity was worth more than stubbornness, I typed back that I always brought grace to the table and that I would be there on time. Then I set my phone down and opened the folder one more time, tracing each step from lien to notice to recorded interest to receipts, and I felt the click of a lock sliding into place in a door that had always been held shut by someone else's hand. By the time I went to bed that night, calm and alert and very much awake, I had decided that I would add one more move before the holiday, a move so simple and clean that nobody could call it cruel even as it took the air out of their performance. And in the morning I would send it, a single sheet that would land on my parents' kitchen counter with the day's mail and stop a refinance dead without raising my voice, because when a story has always been told over you, there is nothing sweeter than turning the volume down and letting the paperwork speak. And if you are wondering what I sent, you can sit with that curiosity for a moment. Because the envelope was already sealed when Ryan messaged me a line that ended with a little trophy emoji I refused to dignify, and I smiled to myself knowing he had no idea that the award he wanted was already engraved with a different name. The morning after I promised myself one last quiet move before the holiday, I printed a single page on plain paper that did not posture or threaten or beg, but simply laid out the facts like a set of traffic lights that would not change no matter how hard someone leaned on the horn. A notice of recorded interest and a statement of redemption terms with every dollar I had paid itemized in clean lines, the statutory interest spelled out, and the instruction that any refinance, transfer, or alteration of title would require my written acknowledgement, and after I signed it with the steady hand I used to envy in other people, I slid it into a certified envelope addressed to my parents, and another to their lender, and a third to the title office that had always treated me like a child dropping in to ask adult questions. And then I took a long breath because I knew that once those envelopes left my hand, the parade my family had been planning would run headfirst into a barricade they could not charm or guilt their way around. I did not need to wait long to see how paper can rearrange a household, because the lender called my father before lunch with language so cautious it might as well have been a whisper, saying that an interested party had requested notice and that any movement would need to reflect that, which is a polite way of saying that the deal he wanted to tuck under the table now had to sit out in the open, where professionals in suits would ask for signatures that could not be forged with sentiment, and when my mother phoned me with that light, scolding voice she saves for moments when she is both afraid and offended, asking whether I had done something that might be interpreted as hostile, I told her that I had made everything clear and traceable, and that clarity only feels hostile when you are used to fog, and the silence that followed told me she understood more than she wanted to admit. Ryan tried humor first because that is his tool when he thinks someone might be won over, sending a message about how paperwork is boring and family is not, saying that we should talk like adults over a drink and find a way to keep the holiday joyful, which sounded like a greeting card dipped in manipulation, so I told him to pick the place and time, and in a booth that had seen 1,000 apologies for 1,000 different sins he smiled the kind of smile that has gotten him out of 100 parking tickets and said that if I removed whatever I had filed, he would make sure I was taken care of later, and I let him talk himself out of breath before sliding across the single page that mattered. Not a demand, not a threat. Just the recorded notice and the line that said, "Any transfer requires my written consent," and I watched him read it and watched the smirk fall off like a sticker that had lost its glue, and when he muttered that this was ridiculous because the house had always been promise to him, I reminded him that promises are not deeds and that banks speak in documents, not lullabies. By the end of that week, the title office had my letter, the lender had his caution flag, and my parents had a green card with my signature attached to a copy of the notice that would sit in their kitchen drawer like a smoke alarm. And every ring of the phone carried a new attempt at rewriting the narrative, my mother warning me that I would regret making things ugly, my father asking whether I understood what legacy meant, Ryan threatening to cut me out of his life, as if that were not the arrangement they had built from the beginning, and I stayed in the same calm lane I had chosen when I bought the lien, repeating that if they wanted a simple path, they could redeem cleanly by reimbursing my costs and acknowledging in writing that any sale or transfer would split proceeds fairly between both children, and if they did not want that, the clock would run how the clock runs and I would stop wasting my breath on family meetings that only ever ended with me paying the tab. The small but brutal justice arrived in the plainest way possible, not as a shouting match at a doorstep or a messy scene captured by a neighbor, but as an email from the recorder's office the afternoon before Thanksgiving, time-stamped and bland, notifying all parties that a quitclaim deed submitted by my parents had been returned unrecordable pending resolution of a previously recorded interest requiring acknowledgement, which meant that while they were at the office trying to staple Ryan's name onto the house like a ribbon on a gift, the system I had set in place weeks earlier had raised its hand and said not yet, not without her, not anymore. And I stood in my kitchen with the window open and let out a laugh I did not recognize because it sounded like somebody who had finally figured out how to make gravity work for her instead of against her. I could have called them in that moment to say that the move had failed and that their announcement would now be an exercise in make-believe. But I have learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people who love performance is to give them the stage they demanded and let reality creep in from the wings when they least expect it. So instead of blowing the whistle, I forwarded the email to my attorney, asked for certified copies for my folder, and then I sent a single text to my mother that said I would be bringing dessert and a bottle, which was the closest thing I could offer to a peace offering without surrendering the only peace I had earned in years. That evening, Ryan showed up at my building without warning because men who have always been welcomed rarely remember how to knock, and in the hallway he switched from charm to anger in one breath, saying I had sabotaged his future and that he would fix it with or without me, and I let him finish because it was important to me to hear the man I had been told to love speak plainly about what he believed he was owed. Then I pointed to the line on the notice that used to be invisible to me and said that if he wanted the house so badly, he could pay what I had paid and sign the fairness agreement, or he could keep storming around making threats that did not count at the county, and he stared at me long enough to see that the old version of me was gone. Then he left with a muttered insult that would have broken me a year ago and now only made me glad I had my own keys. I slept easily for the first time in weeks. Not because everything was resolved, but because I knew that the machinery was now working in my favor and that the next act belonged to me whether they knew it or not. And in the morning I packed the folder, the receipts, the certified copies, and the calm I had rehearsed, and I walked out the door knowing that at that table my mother would make her speech about what my brother deserved, and my father would nod like a metronome, and my aunts would smile. Those tight smiles that signal complicity, and I would let them perform it all because when my turn came I would not need to raise my voice or pound the table. I would only need to lay down a few sheets of paper and say that line they never saw coming. And if you think I am going to preview it here, you will have to wait with them, because the only thing sweeter than justice is timing, and my timing was finally perfect. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, I had already rehearsed every possible outcome in my head, from my mother's grand speech about sacrifice and legacy, to my father's solemn nods that passed for authority, to Ryan's smug grin that was supposed to be proof that destiny was on his side, and I had prepared myself to sit quietly until my moment came, because after years of being told to be gracious, polite, and supportive even when everything tilted against me, I had finally understood that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is the weapon you hold until the exact second it will cut deepest. The house smelled the same as it always did on holidays, heavy with tradition and the sense that rituals matter more than honesty, and as relatives shuffled in with their casseroles and pies, I saw the sideways glances that told me the announcement had already been whispered in corners, that the stage had been set for Ryan to receive his crown in front of witnesses, and that my role was once again the quiet daughter who would smile and clap politely because she was doing fine on her own. I kept my face calm, I poured myself a drink, and I let them believe I was walking straight into their performance with no idea that the script had already been rewritten. When the food had been served and the plates were full enough to keep people in their chairs, my mother stood with that careful posture that means she has something important to say. The room went quiet out of habit, and she began the speech that I had been waiting for, telling everyone how grateful she was that Ryan had stayed close to home, how much he had sacrificed to build stability, how a good family knows how to reward the child who carries on the legacy, and then she announced with a warm, rehearsed smile that the house would be transferred to Ryan because he deserved it, while turning toward me with that condescending softness she has mastered, adding that I was strong and independent and would be fine making my own way. For a moment I let the silence stretch, because I wanted to see the satisfaction on their faces, the smug relief of Ryan leaning back like a king in a chair he had not earned, the approving nods from relatives who had never asked what I carried alone, and the expectant glance from my father waiting for me to respond with grace. But instead of applauding or nodding, I lifted my glass, let the pause grow long enough to tighten every chest in the room, and then I said in the calmest voice I have ever managed that it was interesting, because I had already bought the house out from under them months ago. The look on Ryan's face was worth every hour of planning, a flicker of disbelief collapsing into anger as he searched the table for support that was no longer solid, and my mother's smile froze on her face like a mask that had cracked mid-performance, while my father's head turned sharply as though he had misheard something that could not possibly be true, and for once I did not rush to explain or soften the blow. I simply set my glass down, leaned back, and let them sit in the weight of a truth that did not need embellishment. Of course, the silence did not last, because silence is a vacuum and families like mine cannot survive a vacuum, so within seconds came the denials, my mother insisting that I must be confused, my father demanding to know what I had done. Ryan laughing a little too loudly in that brittle way men laugh when they are cornered, but I kept my voice steady as I told them that I had every document, every receipt, every certified notice, and that if anyone wanted to question it, the county clerk's office would be happy to provide them with copies of the exact same records, which meant that their opinions about what I deserved no longer mattered because the system had already spoken in ink and signatures. I wish I could say the room erupted in support, but the truth is most relatives sat frozen, caught between the comfort of the old story and the undeniable reality of the new one, and in their hesitation I finally saw what I had been missing all along, which was that people will always choose the version of events that costs them the least, and for years that version was the one where I carried my burdens quietly while Ryan was lifted up, but now that narrative had been broken in a way that could not be repaired, and even if they did not cheer, they would remember this moment every time they saw me, and that was more valuable than a round of applause. Ryan eventually broke the stalemate by slamming his hand on the table, demanding to know how I could betray family, as though betrayal were not the foundation of the entire arrangement. And I looked him straight in the eye and said that buying a property legally with my own money was not betrayal, but building your future on the assumption that your sister's needs do not matter is, and the silence that followed was heavier than before, because everyone at the table knew exactly which version of betrayal was real. I did not drag the scene out, because victory does not need screaming, so I stood, placed the folder of documents in the center of the table for anyone who wanted proof, and told them that I would be leaving early because I had better things to do than sit through a performance where the ending had already been rewritten. Then I wished everyone a happy holiday and walked out while the shock still hung in the air. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had finally stolen back the authority they had taken from me. As I closed the door behind me and heard the muffled eruption of voices on the other side, I realized that the cliffhanger they had planned for me had become my cliffhanger for them, because now they would spend the rest of the night arguing over what I had done, who had missed the signs, and what it meant for their future, while I already knew the answer, which was that the power had shifted, permanently and without apology, and all that was left for me was to decide how loudly I wanted the next chapter to be read. When I walked back into my own apartment after leaving that table behind, I did not feel triumph in the way movies like to package it with soaring music and dramatic close-ups. Instead, I felt something heavier and steadier. The kind of quiet satisfaction that comes when a fight you never chose finally ends on your terms, and as I set the folder down on my kitchen counter, I realized that my parents and my brother were probably still sitting in that dining room, voices raised, emotions fraying. Each one of them trying to salvage the story they had spent years telling about who I was and what I deserved, only to find that the evidence in front of them had stripped away every excuse, leaving nothing but the truth they had always refused to acknowledge. The call started almost immediately. First, my mother, with her voice trembling between anger and desperation, telling me that what I had done was cruel and unnecessary, that I had embarrassed her in front of the family, that I had turned a holiday into a spectacle, and I listened without interrupting because I had learned long ago that when people speak like that, they are not really talking to you, they are talking to themselves, clinging to an illusion that has already slipped through their fingers. And when she finally demanded to know whether I was proud of humiliating my brother, I told her that I was not proud of humiliating anyone, I was proud of refusing to be humiliated myself. And then I hung up before she could twist that into another accusation. My father tried a different angle, calling later that night with his heavy sighs and his measured words, asking whether I could find it in myself to undo what I had done, framing it as a gesture of family unity, reminding me of childhood moments when we all gathered under that roof, as if nostalgia could erase the imbalance of decades, and I let him finish before I said that I was not the one who had undone the family they had, years ago, when they decided that one child deserved protection. and the other deserved tests of strength, and if he wanted unity, he could begin by acknowledging that my strength was not a liability to be exploited, but a right I had claimed at last. Ryan did not bother with persuasion. He came straight to rage, sending message after message about how I had ruined his future, how I had taken from him what was his, how I would pay for this when everyone turned against me, and I read his words slowly. Not with fear, but with the detached recognition that for the first time in his life he was facing the consequences of something not being handed to him, and when I finally replied, I kept it short enough to pierce, but long enough to echo. Telling him that if his future could be ruined by his sister's ability to read documents and sign checks, then perhaps it was never much of a future to begin with. The next morning, when the adrenaline had cooled and the weight of everything settled into my bones, I realized that what I had truly bought was not just a house, not just a set of walls and deeds and receipts, but the end of a story that had defined me for too long. The story where I was the supporting character, the resilient daughter who did not need help, the one who could be pushed aside because she would survive without applause, and by rewriting that ending, I had shown them that resilience is not permission for exploitation. It is power waiting to be recognized, and once claimed it cannot be returned. In the days that followed, relatives called with their half-hearted attempts at neutrality, saying they understood my frustration, but perhaps I had gone too far, suggesting that family matters should not be handled so publicly. But every single one of them had sat quietly at that table while my mother announced that I would receive nothing, and not one of them had spoken up in my defense, so I told them politely that silence is also a choice, and if they were uncomfortable with how I revealed the truth, perhaps they should be equally uncomfortable with how they had allowed the lie to stand. I know there will be consequences that linger, strained holidays, birthdays celebrated separately, whispered criticisms about how I changed, but the truth is I did not change at all. I simply stopped allowing their version of me to run unchallenged. And while they may spend the rest of their lives trying to rebuild the myth of Ryan as the rightful heir, I will live each day knowing that I proved them wrong without needing to shout, without needing to beg, without needing to collapse under their pressure, because I learned to speak in the language they had always respected most, the language of contracts and signatures, and I spoke it fluently enough to leave them speechless. On the night I finally sat alone in that house, the one they had sworn was never meant for me, I walked through each room slowly. Not as a conqueror, but as someone reacquainting herself with a place she had been exiled from in spirit long before she was told so outright, and I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who swallowed the bitterness of every unfair holiday toast, the one who accepted that she would always stand on the sidelines, and I wished I could tell her that one day she would stand in the center not because they invited her but because she took the invitation herself and made it impossible to revoke. The truth is there will always be people who call what I did ruthless, who argue that family matters should never be handled with paperwork and precision. But those same people will never understand what it feels like to be told over and over that your strength makes you less worthy of care, and so I do not waste my breath on them, because I did not do this to earn applause from outsiders. I did it to free myself from a family script that was never written for my benefit, and in that freedom I finally found peace. So if you ask me whether it was worth it, whether the silence that followed my announcement was sweeter than applause, I will tell you that it was, because silence in that moment did not mean dismissal. It meant shock. It meant recognition. It meant that for once they had nothing to say, and for the first time in my life, the silence belonged to me.